Maybe you've wondered what the difference is between the Buddha and other awakened beings, or other people who have attained enlightenment. We're going to look at that question today, in particular with reference to early Buddhism, what we find in the earliest Buddhist texts, because this is something that's going to change quite a bit over the history of Buddhist Dharma. So I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org, where you can go to find courses about early Buddhism and early Buddhist thought. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So this video comes up, it was a question by Martin Cross over at my Patreon page. You might want to check that out, where I have people who, you can ask questions and I will try to answer them. This is one of the ways that I can answer a question like that, because it's really quite a big question, bigger than I can really answer in a short little response. Before I get to the answer to Martin's question, though, I wanted to spend a moment talking about this being the 3rd anniversary of this channel. So I started this channel, 3 years ago. This is early March 2020, and it's been an amazing year. Done an enormous amount, bringing early Buddhist Dharma in a contemporary perspective to all of you. Many videos I've done over many different topics. I won't list them all here, but if you want, you can go back and look them over. Also, we've had quite a bit going on over on Patreon. I've expanded that quite a bit. The offerings over there, I've been starting to do behind-the-scenes videos, question and answer videos, even a little book club we're starting up. And also, this year was the year where I founded the Online Dharma Institute, where, as I say, I try to bring larger, deeper courses about early Buddhism for those who are interested in such things, because some people really do want a sort of a deeper dive and want to learn more about the specifics of early Buddhism and Buddhist Dharma in general, more than I can really get across on YouTube videos. So this has been a wonderful year, and to celebrate that, this week, I will be doing a special on the courses over at the Online Dharma Institute, and I'll put a link down below for this week for anybody who is interested. Take a look at it. It'll be in the show notes and in a pinned comment, as long as the deal is around. Back to Martin's question, though. In the early texts, people who attained awakening were generally termed arahants. Arahant is a Pali term which basically means worthy ones. That is to say that they were worthy of veneration. It's a term that did not originate with the Buddha. It seems to have been around at the time as an epithet, a description of people who were considered worthy within their particular religious or philosophical context. And in the Buddha's first recorded conversation with somebody after he attained awakening, at least as it comes down to us today, the one that is described in the early texts as the first conversation he had with another person, another human being after having attained awakening, he describes himself as being an arahant as well as being a Buddha. So it's a description that the Buddha is supposed to have given to himself as well as the description Buddha. In other words, he calls himself an arahant too. So it's not as though arahants are only a description for people that aren't Buddhas, let's say. Now, Bhikkhu Bodhi, the great translator and philosopher or thinker about early Buddhism, as well as being a Western monastic, has written a paper about this whole topic, which I'll have a link to in the show notes below. And Bhikkhu Bodhi talks about how the Buddha describes both his own awakening and the awakening of arahants in the same way. That is to say, he uses the same language. So, for example, the language would be, being myself liable to grow old, fall sick, die, sorrow, and become corrupted, understanding the drawbacks in these things, I sought the unaging, unailing, undying, sorrowless, uncorrupted, supreme sanctuary, extinguishment, and I found it. So in this case, if we look at the descriptions, they're the same description. So what this suggests is that the state that they have attained is the same state. there isn't any difference between the awakening of the Buddha and the awakening of an Arahant, who is, let's say, studying the Buddha Dharma under the Buddha. Now, the Buddha does also say in a different text, in a different sutta, he talks about what are called the 10 Tathagata powers. Tathagata is another word for the Buddha. So these are supposedly 10 powers that the Buddha has that are specific to him, as opposed to being the kinds of things that other awakened beings can do. However, if we look at the list, and I'm not going to go through it all here, it's rather lengthy, but there's 10 of them. But the point is, if you look at the list, these are not things that are a difference in kind that the Buddha has. They're rather differences in degree. That is to say, that the Buddha knows, let's say, what is possible and impossible to a greater degree than your average, let's say, Arahant would know. And he knows the minds of other beings and so on. And these are all basically abilities that seem, at least to me, to be around the ability to teach. In other words, he knows a whole bunch of things about the world and other people that allows him to teach very effectively by knowing what each person is capable of and not capable of, by knowing their minds, their mindset, and so on, which your ordinary Arahant is not going to be able to do. They're not going to be as good a teacher as the Buddha is. Now, in one of the early suttas, the Buddha has a discussion with monastics on this very topic, on the topic of the difference between himself as a Buddha and the attainments or the abilities of the other monastics around him who are awakened. He says that both the Buddha and these monastics are freed by not grasping, due to disillusionment, dispassion, and cessation regarding the aggregates. And the aggregates, I have an earlier video on what the aggregates are. There's 5 aggregates. I'll put a link to that in the show notes below in case you're interested in learning more about it. Basically, the aggregates is a description of the person, the human person. So there's 5 of them. One of the aggregates is the body, and another 4 aggregates are various aspects of the mind, perception and will or volition, and consciousness and perception. And these are the ways that we construct ourselves. And the point is that in order to become awakened, we have to become disillusioned with all of this. In other words, we have to lose our illusions about it. I mean, literally. The illusion that this is permanent, the illusion that this is something to cling to. And that a process of disillusionment and so non-clinging, non-identification, is the same, the Buddha says, for himself and for his monastics when they become awakened. Having said this, though, the Buddha then continues and then asks his monastics, okay, given what I've just said, what is the difference then between me as a Buddha and you as, let's say, monastics or awakened monastics even? What is the difference here? And it's clear the monastics aren't really sure, and so they want the Buddha to clarify this. So the Buddha answers them, and this is what he says. He says that a Buddha gives rise to the unarisen path, gives birth to the unborn path, and explains the unexplained path. They know the path, understand the path, and are experts in the path. And now the disciples live following the path. They acquire it later. That is to say, the key difference between the Buddha and the Arahants, or the awakened monastics, is that the Buddha discovered the path first and is the teacher, is the person who discovered it and teaches it. Whereas these awakened Arahants are people who have learned from somebody who is a Buddha, learned from somebody who has already discovered it and is their teacher. So the Buddha is unique in having discovered it for himself. Now, there are, let's be clear, what are called Pacceka Buddhas in early Buddhism. That is to say, there are, Pacceka Buddha means a lone Buddha, a Buddha who has discovered this material for himself or for herself, but then declines to teach. Now, Pacceka Buddhas are recognized in early Buddhism as a possibility, That is to say that throughout history there will be certain people who will, let's say, discover the Dharma for themselves by, let's say, just meditating by themselves somewhere in a small community or alone in the forest, but just decline to teach. And indeed, even the Buddha himself, when he became awakened, for a moment there, afterwards, contemplated not teaching. And so almost, you might say, almost became a Pacceka Buddha. But so the difference here is that while the Pacceka Buddha and the Buddha both discover the Dharma for themselves, they're not taught it by anybody, the Pacceka Buddha declines to teach. And so as a result doesn't have the social and worldly impact that a Buddha has. So we see that the major distinction in the early texts between the Buddha or a Buddha and anybody else who's awakened is that the Buddha is the supreme teacher. That's the major distinction. There are minor distinctions we saw in the case of the Tathagata powers, which are basically powers around being able to teach, having a deep knowledge about other people and their abilities and not. There also are discussions in the early texts about certain kinds of meditative attainments that some people might have and other people might not. But again, those don't necessarily specify a Buddha, at least in the early texts. They certainly specify meditative abilities, which some Arahants may have and other Arahants may not. But in the final analysis, there's no meditative ability that is as important as awakening itself. So the fact of having attained awakening sort of trumps everything else that is all other abilities and so on that one has in early Buddhism. And to that extent, a Buddha and another awakened being are on the same footing. They have the same attainment. Now, what might be good at this point is to look at an earlier video of mine where I talk about this idea of a historical Buddha, whether there was one. Because this is the kind of question I think may be in your mind. It certainly is in the minds of some people, and I have an earlier video on that. I'll put it up on the screen here. I would suggest checking it out. See some reasoning about the historical Buddha himself. I hope that this has been useful, and I'll hope to catch you on the next one of these videos. And all of you, be well.